It's 4 a.m. I'm in my bed, and this is normal for me. I wake up at 4 most mornings. But I woke up earlier than I wanted to be, and my brain has already been running for the last 20 minutes. It's built a complete case for why I should call my manager when the workday starts and hand the project back. Not in a panic, as a considered decision. I've thought it through. I've weighed it up. I've decided that the right thing to do, the responsible thing to do, is to step back from the work I've been leading for 6 months. This episode is about that morning, what the voice in my head was telling me, what I almost did and what I did instead, what I've come to understand with the benefit of time and some neuroscience, and about why our brains do this to us in the quiet hours and what we can actually do with it. Welcome to The Threshold, where we say the quiet part of leadership out loud. A show about the space between who you were and who the role asks you to be. I'm Amanda Ramplin. This episode is a bit different to the ones before it. In the first 3 episodes, I've told stories about leaders I've worked with and about patterns I've noticed in the rooms I've been in. Today, I want to tell you about one specific morning from my own life because I think it captures something most senior leaders will recognise, even if we don't often say it out loud. See, in our world, vulnerability still gets read as weakness more often than as leadership. I don't think that's true. I think the willingness to look at what's actually happening, even when it's hard, is one of the most important things a leader can do. I'm going to take you through the morning, what I was carrying, what the voice in my head was saying, and what I almost did. Then I'm going to come back and tell you what I've come to understand about that voice, the science of it, why it shows up the way it does, and what I've learned to do with it. Let me take you to that morning. I was leading a major piece of work that would shape the future of the retail bank. I'm not going to get into the detail of the project because the project isn't the story. What matters is that the work was significant and the decisions we were making would affect people. The pressure to get it right was real, and at this point I'd been carrying it for about 6 months. So for most of those 6 months, I'd been waking up at 3:30 a.m. Not every morning, but often enough that it had become a pattern. And the voice would already be running before I'd fully registered that I was awake. The voice ran on 3 things. The first was the pressure of getting the work right, the pressure of leading a team through it, and the pressure of making decisions that would stand up to scrutiny later. The second was the impact on people. The decisions we were making would affect real people's working lives. The voice didn't let me forget that, and it didn't let me forget it for a second. And the third, underneath both of those, was a deeper question. Am I doing the right thing? Not whether I was doing the work correctly, but whether I should be doing it at all, whether the responsibility for this work should be sitting with someone else. That was the shape of most of my mornings for those 6 months. The morning I want to tell you about came after a meeting the previous afternoon. The meeting had been hard, and not in the way that sometimes meetings can go badly. It had been hard in the way that meetings sometimes have to be when you're leading change in a senior environment. The role I was in required me to challenge the thinking of people who were more senior to me, to make a case for a direction they weren't initially aligned with. These people wanted to see all the potential outcomes, so I was doing just that. And I'd done it. I'd held my position, I'd made the case, I'd pushed back where I needed to, so by every reasonable measure of doing the job the role had asked me to do, I had done it. But that's not what I went to bed thinking. I went to bed turning the meeting over in my head, replaying what I'd said, reading expressions, wondering how it had landed. I woke up at 3 a.m. the next morning and the voice was already in full flight. It had ran through the meeting in detail. The words I'd used, the expressions I thought I'd seen, the relationships I was sure I'd damaged. And by the time it had finished with the meeting, it had moved on to the project, then on to me, and the case it was building wasn't kind. And then somewhere just before 4 a.m. in the morning, the voice arrived at a decision. It told me the responsible thing to do was to hand the project back. Not as a failure, as a considered choice. See, the voice was very rational about it. It told me the work needed to be done by someone with more political capital. It told me that stepping back wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. By the time the sun started to come up, I had it worked out. The call I would make, the way I would frame it, the whole thing planned. And I didn't. Not because the voice quieted. The voice didn't quiet. It kept running. But some part of me, the part of me that was beginning to recognize this pattern, knew that 4 or 5 a.m. decisions are different from daylight decisions. I had this nagging feeling that if I made this call before lunch, I'd regret it by dinner. So I made a small deal with myself. I wouldn't hand the project back at 5 a.m. I wouldn't hand it back before coffee. I wouldn't hand it back before I'd at least talk to someone. I gave myself until lunchtime. I went into the office. I did my morning meetings. I was still carrying the voice. It hadn't got anywhere. It was running in the background through every interaction. But I noticed something different happening that day. I wasn't feeding it. I wasn't giving it more material to chew on. I wasn't replaying the meeting again. I wasn't rehearsing the call to my manager. I was just letting my brain do other things. This was something I've been learning to do gradually over the previous months. Not because I had a name for it, just because I'd noticed that the mornings I'd spent most catastrophic were the mornings I kept dwelling. And the mornings that quietened faster were the mornings I gave my brain something else to think about for a while. Sometime mid-morning, in a quiet moment between meetings, I came back to it, deliberately, not from inside the spin, but from a slightly steadier place. I named what was happening. I told myself this is the 4 a.m. voice. It's not the truth. It's my brain running without context. And I worked through possible outcomes, methodically, not in the way the voice had been working through them, where every scenario was a catastrophe. Properly. What had actually happened in the meeting, what had actually been said, and what had been the response. What was likely to happen next with the project, with the relationships, and with my role. As I did it, I realized something. The specifics I'd been replaying at 4 a.m. weren't actually there. The things I'd thought had gone wrong were things I'd feared had gone wrong, not things that had actually happened. And the response I imagined the executives having wasn't a response they had actually given me. The meeting hadn't been the problem. The meeting had been hard because it had to be hard. I'd done the job the role asked me to do. What I was carrying wasn't the meeting, it was something else. The meeting hadn't actually been a disaster. It had been a hard meeting, but those are different things. But at 4 a.m, my brain didn't know the difference. I didn't hand the project back. I continued to lead it. The executives I'd challenged in that meeting remain some of my strongest supporters today because I was doing the work they asked me to do, turning over every rock and challenging every assumption. The 5 a.m. voice kept showing up, not as often, but it was still there from time to time. The difference after that morning was that I started to recognize it as a pattern and not as the truth. Looking back at that morning now, with everything I've learned about how the brain actually works in those hours, I can see what was happening to me. I tend to call it the 5 a.m. voice because that's the middle of the window when most senior leaders describe it running. For me, it usually shows up at 3:30. For you, it might be 5 or 5:30. The clock time is less important than what's happening underneath. The pattern is the same. At the time, I thought the voice was telling me the truth. I thought those early hours were when the rest of the noise dropped away and my real assessment of myself was finally coming through. I thought the voice was honest in a way that the daytime voice wasn't, but it was almost the opposite. There's a network in the brain neuroscientists call the default mode network. It's a network that activates when we're not focused on a task, when we're driving familiar roads and our mind wanders, or in the shower and a thought just appears. When we wake up early and we're no longer asleep but not yet engaged with anything, the default mode network is what's running. This network is responsible for what researchers call self-referential thinking. Thinking about ourselves, thinking about how we're perceived, thinking about past conversations and future ones. It's a part of the brain that makes meaning out of our lives and our place in them. Useful much of the time, but at 5 a.m., with nothing else to anchor it, it spins. The same thoughts return, the same scenarios get rehearsed. And that's what was happening to me that morning. My brain was running through the meeting in loops. The same 5 minutes, replayed and replayed. There's also something happening biologically. There's a measurable spike in cortisol in the first 30 to 60 minutes after we wake up. It's normal, and it's how the body transitions from sleep to activity. But cortisol does more than wake us up. It also amplifies threat detection. It makes the brain more sensitive to anything that looks like a problem. So in the same window when my default mode network was spinning on the meeting, cortisol was making the spin feel urgent. And the problems my brain was rehearsing didn't just appear, they appeared with an edge. There's a third thing that's happening that I think is the most important one. The relationship between two parts of the brain is significantly different at 5 a.m. than it is later in the day. The amygdala, the part of the brain that scans for threat, is online. Cortisol has activated it and it's looking for problems and it's finding them. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that provides perspective, considers context, weighs evidence, is only partially online. Sleep architecture takes a while to fully release. So the part of you that would normally balance threat with context isn't fully there yet. This means at 5 a.m., our brain has access to threat without context. So essentially to fear without perspective and to problems without proportion. Which was exactly what was happening to me. The amygdala had a meeting to chew on. The prefrontal cortex that would have said it was a hard meeting, you did your job, this is normal, wasn't there. So I was getting threat without perspective. The meeting was being processed as evidence of a pattern that would cost me the project, instead of one hard afternoon in a 6-month piece of work. Here's a way to feel about this. Most of us have had the experience of being utterly convinced of something at 3 a.m. that doesn't survive contact with daylight. The decisions we were going to make, the conversations we were going to have, the dramatic action that seemed clearly necessary at 3 in the morning. By 7 a.m., none of it's urgent anymore. By 11 a.m., we can't quite remember why it felt so important. That's exactly what happened to me. The decision to hand the project back, which felt so clearly right at 5 a.m., didn't survive being brought into daylight conversation with my manager. Nothing had changed about the meeting, and nothing had changed about the project. What had changed was the conditions in my brain. And here's what I want you to hear from this, because the line that stayed with me. The voice at 5 a.m. is not your better judgment. It's your brain running without context. So what do you do with this? Well, I want to share 3 things I've learned about the 5 a.m. voice that I wish I'd understood sooner. The first is to name it for what it is. There's a useful idea from neuroscience and therapy work called name it to tame it. The phrase comes from Dan Siegel, a psychiatrist who studies how our brain processes emotion. The idea is that simply naming what's happening changes our relationship with it. You stop being inside the experience and start observing it. When the voice is running, this works powerfully. Just to say to yourself, this is the 4 a.m. voice or the 5 a.m. voice, whichever yours is. Not to fight it, not to dismiss it, just to recognize it for what it is. The naming itself does something specific in the brain. It activates the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of you that has perspective. Just by naming, you're bringing the adult into the room. This was the move that I came back to. Not at 4 a.m. when the voice was the loudest, but later when my brain was functioning more fully. Just sitting with it briefly and naming it for what it was. The second is don't make decisions in those hours. Whatever the voice is telling you to do at 5 a.m., don't do it. Not before 9 a.m. at the earliest. If the action still feels important after coffee, after the prefrontal cortex has come online, after you've had a chance to assess in normal conditions, then consider it. But the 5 a.m. decision is almost never the one to act on. I almost made a 5 a.m. decision that morning. I almost called my manager and handed back a piece of work that I'd been leading for 6 months. And the decision felt right at 5 a.m., but it would have been completely wrong by lunchtime if I'd acted on it before then. This is a practice that has saved me. Whatever the voice tells me to do in those hours, I wait. Almost always by mid-morning, my perspective has changed. The third, and this is the one I think mattered most that morning, is I gave my brain something else to do, and then I came back to it deliberately. When the voice is running, the worst thing you can do is to keep feeding it, replaying the meeting, rehearsing the conversation, turning it over again and again. Every time you do, you're giving it more material to spin on. The move is to interrupt the spin, not by trying to silence the voice, but by giving your brain something else to focus on. Go to work, have your morning meetings, make coffee, walk somewhere. Let your brain do other things for a while. Then later, when your prefrontal cortex isn't half asleep, come back to whatever the voice was saying, but deliberately, not from inside the spin, from a steadier place. Work through the possible outcomes properly. What actually happened? What was actually said? What's likely to happen next? Methodically, not catastrophically. Most of the time when you do this, you discover what I discovered that morning. The specifics the voice was building its case on aren't actually there. The fears were real, but the evidence wasn't. This is the practice I keep coming back to. Not because the voice ever fully goes away. It still shows up. But because this is how I work through it when it does. If you're at the threshold right now, here's what I'd offer you. What does your 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. voice keep returning to? Not generally, specifically. What's the conversation it keeps rehearsing? And what's the moment it keeps pointing back to? What's the verdict it keeps trying to deliver? And then a second question. Could you give yourself permission to set it down for a few hours? To let your brain do other things and come back to it later in the daylight when you can think about it properly? To name it for what it is and work through the possible outcomes from a steadier place. You don't need to answer that. Just sit with it. This has been episode 4 of The Threshold. Next time, we'll go in a different direction. We'll talk about what ultramarathons taught me about leadership. Specifically, what happens at the edge of capability when your body wants to stop and your mind starts negotiating. And the capacity to stay through that turns out to be the same capacity that gets us through any genuine threshold. If this episode landed, the most helpful thing you can do is share it with one person. Someone you know who wakes up too early with the voice running, who hasn't quite had the language for what's happening, who could use the recognition that it's their brain and not the truth. If you haven't already, follow the show wherever you're listening so the next episode finds you. And if you have 30 seconds, leave a review. Your review genuinely helps other leaders find this work. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in 2 weeks.